Thank you. Thank you. All of our speakers were very good. They finished their contributions. They've come to the end of their own contributions. Now we could get started with the question and answer sessions. Please take the floor.
Вот там вот. Ну давайте сначала там, потом да, давайте.
So you go first. My name is Massimiliano Zannone. I'm a financial risk manager. I worked throughout Europe. I'd like to ask a question to President Mucchetti. The Jesuit probably has already partially answered my question. There's one assumption that I wish to share with you. Capitalism is based on debt. Oftentimes we look at the opposite side of that. So we can say that capitalism is based again on debit or on credit. And Mucchetti told us that the crisis took off because of the private indebtment. And this is quite clear because when the money is cheap, basically, more people tend to borrow it. But the problem comes when it is the state that borrows money. And we also have to remember that public indebtment is always a gain for the private. In that case, we have an ethic issue, a political issue, and to this, I think that the Jesuit has already said something. So to President Mucchetti, I would like to say, why do we always talk about this as if it were a moral issue when it is also political?
Это вам вопрос, конечно.
Se ho capito bene la domanda perché la
I hope I understood correctly because I can hear you properly, but I believe that what you said is the following. You were saying that public debt is often considered as a sin, as a moral sin, whereas a private debt is not considered as such. But why don't we only talk about economic issues? A problem that can be solved with economic and financial tools. Well, personally speaking, I referred again to the German language, considering again debt as sin, but or guilt. But political systems, the ruling classes, especially in the Western world, have never considered debt as if it were a sin. In the 19th century, the one who would go bankrupt would commit a suicide, but after Chapter 11 in the US, nobody has ever committed suicide ever more. Basically, you just close a situation and you start another situation. And in Italy and in the rest of Europe, again, debt is never considered as a sin. As a matter of fact, for long years, we've tended to think that a certain amount of debt, even a large amount of debts, could be a way to optimize own equity returns, but that proved to be wrong. Because in 2007, 2008, basically, it was very much a family indebtment in the US, most specifically to question the whole system. The establishment would consider public debt dangerous, as public debt was the government, with the government looking also for consent, as is the case for all democratic systems. Whereas with a wrong ideological assumption, people would think that the private sector would always correct one's mistake in real time so as never to come to a breaking point, because those who did wrong and would go bankrupt would be replaced by somebody else doing things properly. But unfortunately, this paradigm didn't work, didn't prove to be right. So this, I believe, is the critical issue. And if I may add my personal comment, I believe that the Vice President of Gazprom Bank said something very interesting when he highlighted that today a growing quantity of financing to the economy come not from the banking system as a formal system under the vigilance, whether short-sighted, long-sighted, or far-sighted of central bank, but it is rather checked on by shadow banking, which is often a system which seems to be even more efficient than the traditional banking system. If I issue loans to companies without analyzing the creditworthiness of the borrower, but just based on the algorithms, and the deposits are obtained to platforms, you may very well understand that the industrial costs are very low. So if everything is organized so as to reduce bad debt, it seems like the situation is solved. But again, this is not totally correct, in that the devil also hides in the details. If I may, I'd like to add my short comment. Actually, shadow banking seems to be more efficient and faster in its decision-making process, and the efficiency seems to be higher altogether compared to the formal banking system. But you should also understand that the banking system has a long-standing tradition in managing risks when connected to credits and loans, and if we don't have a vision and we lose contact with the risks and we issue many loans, we don't do nothing but just increasing that bubble or promoting that bubble that we've seen exploding recently. But rather than the electronic economy bubble, we're now going to have a credit bubble. We recently met with one of the largest financial companies in the US. We assessed the risks, and we believe that shadow banking cannot be a solution to all challenges. It does represent an alternative, but what about the future? What about the future of traditional banks or fin banking? Well, I think that a hybrid solution is to be found in that probably the grid is going to be that of traditional banks, where there's the interface with a client. It could be very different and diverse because, as a matter of fact, many people can leave the traditional banking to operate in the shadow banking sector. I'd like to ask a question to Senator Mucchetti. And by the way, I share with his political position, but the referendum of December the 4th is certainly no subject to be talked of here. But there's something that is a bit controversial about what you said when it comes to the TTIP being in a stagnation, and you basically complaining about that, because this morning, for example, was also said that a potential election of Hillary Clinton can engender some problems in the Eurasian area, considering the interaction of European and Eurasian countries, and with a specific reference to the Russian Federation. Has Mrs. Clinton said that if the US is not part of a treaty, no treaty can ever be considered as effective? Luckily enough for France and the UK, this interrupted negotiation on TTIP. We see that negative results are obtained in Veneto agriculture because of the counter-sanction that are leveraged against us by Russia, and this is true also for tool machine industry. And once we are out of the Russian market, it is going to be very difficult for to replace the new countries that are entering into new agreements with the Russian clients. So I believe that if the TIP goes on, there are going to be problems because we have to trust American products with the control of the American authorities rather than of the Italian authority. But if we live 4 or 5 years more than Americans, it's probably because we eat better. And as a matter of fact, Russians were very pleased with Italian food products up until sanctions were raised. And then for us here in Verona, there's no point in raising sanctions to safeguard the interest of Ukraine that hold the paintings of Castelvecchio that comes from close to here. I think that we should raise sanctions against Ukraine. The mayor of Verona was there this morning. He talked with Mr. Renzi, and Mr. Renzi said, I'm going to talk to the president of Ukraine, and by November, apparently, you're going to go to get back your paintings from Ukraine. But we'll have to wait for that. Anyway, I believe that sending 150 troops to the borders of Russia as part of the NATO troops, it can be risky. We know that in Italy we never received anything ill from Russia, but we sent voluntary troops with Napoleon, and then with Hitler there were not so voluntary troops, but still we had to deal with the 100,000 Alpines being suffering a lot against Russia. Russia has never done anything ill against us, so there's no point in us as Italians, as people from Verona, doing anything ill against Russians. I'm going to be very short. I'm certainly not for the TTIP, or I'm not for anything in particular, but what I'm saying is that whenever trade and relations are at stake, I think that a noble stance has to be maintained with a clear vision of each national interests. I share with the concerns that were voiced. I understand that there's no point in sharing in the U.S. attitude, raising borders on the one hand to safeguard their economy and sending troops. I believe that they are a bit schizophrenic in that. Italy has contributed 140 troops, and that, I believe, out of the 6,000 is a symbolic number. It doesn't mean much. I certainly that 140 troops don't scare anybody. There are other initiatives, as the one that we are celebrating here today, which bears witness to the lively interest of our country vis-à-vis Russia. The proposals that were voiced by President Prodi this morning are certainly to be held in the greatest consideration, and I believe that our government and the Foreign Affairs Minister should actually consider these as most important. So I share with what you said, but I just would like to remind you that when sanctions were raised, I had expressed my opinion against, as I thought that perhaps at that time we should have insisted on South Stream. South Stream, that oil pipeline through the Black Sea, not because we should be against that, but because looking at the quote, I didn't quite see the point. Maybe I'm wrong. So I had some reservation on that. As to sanctions, I had my doubts there again. As for the Germans, basically they want stronger sanctions, but then they enter into business. So I don't quite understand their attitude. So I believe that we should be open vis-à-vis the Atlantic and vis-à-vis the Urals towards Eurasian continent. So I don't think there's any point in just opening up towards one single front, because, thank you. As Luciano La Rivera was saying, the world doesn't just see the opposition of two fronts, but there are 4 or 5 macro regions that are all equally important. Thank you.
Salve, sono Flavio Tabanelli della Executive Intelligence Review.
This is an intelligence executive review. We've said that there is a lack of brave leaders in Europe. Mucchetti and other speakers as well. I'd like to know what they're saying and what was said ever since mid-July of the time bomb of the Deutsche Bank. That is, and obviously in past times, I know that that was in favor of the Glass-Steagall Act. And as I was saying, I'd like to know, how does he see the Deutsche Bank proposal, the one of having a bailout, but not like the ones that were agreed before, but rather a bailout condition to bringing back the German bank back to the standards that Alfred Herrhausen had in mind in order to go back to the real economy, the pro-industrial real economy. Now, very quickly, Deutsche Bank for many years has no longer been a real economy bank, but rather it turned into an investment bank, probably the biggest, largest bank in Europe. That's one of a leader bank worldwide. That it belongs more to the Wall Street system rather than to the European banking system. I see President Prodi sitting here in front of me, and I would like to recall that time when, in the year 2001, we spread the news that the Deutsche Bank started selling the Italian state bonds without the Italian government worrying about that. We had already talked about that. That was an open hostility act, and in just a few days the spread went bust and crazy. And as often happened to that government, as well as to many others, there were problems. They did not foresee the storm in which they would be caught. The Deutsche Bank, for many years, has been having its own books and accounts that haven't been checked. It was just enough to check how the derivative activities were allocated according to the accounting principles of the United States and according to the international ones. It was clear that there was something fishy there. Now, this is of public dominion. And now the point is whether to look at the glass and thinking that that's a half-full glass. And if it's not half full, we have to start pouring something in it, because the emergence and the surfacing of the Deutsche Bank case should lead and induce the Italian market regulators to change the rules that are by now pro-cyclical, because they tend to increase difficulties when the difficulties are already there. And it's not anti-cyclical, meaning that they should help us solve the problems. So whenever the point is the one of Monte dei Paschi or Banca Etruria or Banca Popolare di Vicenza, we will see whether they will be as strict with the Deutsche Bank in trying to doing real reckoning and trying to understand how big and how deep is the Deutsche Bank problem, hence what kind of solution should be taken. Now, I believe that whenever it boils down to Deutsche Bank, we tend to be not strict and very much permissive. But if the single surveillance in Europe is not going to have two different ways and two different measurements, but rather it's going to be strict, they will realize that the banking sector politics needs to be reviewed and policies need to be reviewed. Well, one of the speakers, I forgot the name, said something about the de-dollarization in the payment system of the so-called interchange. I wonder what's going on in Eurasia and in Russia, Belarus. There are practical difficulties, divergences in terms of interests. And I believe that there are lots of problems, many problems within the free trade area. I believe that I'd like to just refer to the statistics, not down to decimals, but the trade with Belarus and Kazakhstan, the quota of the ruble was as high as 60, 70, 80% even. And it was absolutely free, to the exception of energy resources. And there was a clearing of accountability of accountants and accountancy principles, because the 1.50% is normally accepted both in Kazakhstan and in Belarus with their own foreign trading activities. And if we talk about the trading activities between Russia and China, there is a consequential policy, interaction policy between the central bank in Russia and the People Bank in China, so much so that by now there is a stable climate whereby rubles and yuans in the foreign trade activities entail very modest quotas, and nonetheless the trends are growing. The communication coming from the central bank, especially on the basis of mutual clearing guarantees, allow for some growth. This is something that seems to be working out fine. And China, by addressing Europe and America, was really being very active in order to try and create a series of trading centers in offshore areas by using the yuan, and we are referring to tens of thousands and hundreds of billions of yuans. And that is a technology which is well known. It works. And let me stress that if we have to consider rubles, yuan, rupees, and if the accounts were made sort of handmade, many currencies, such as the ruble or the yuan, entail automatic payments, meaning that there is the same procedures that we adopt in euros or in dollars. Yes, theoretically, we still have some 10 minutes to go, but as a matter of fact, we are very late. And in order to reduce our delay, I believe that we should end here the panel. I'd like to thank all of the participants.